Great. Well, thank you very much, and thank you also for the opportunity to speak to you today. I also want to thank, ironically, Bangalore Airport, because I almost didn't make my flight last night to get here, and my luggage, in fact, didn't make my flight to get here. And they actually did track it down for me, and because as of about an hour ago, I would have been making this presentation in my shorts and T-shirt. So I'm very grateful to Bangalore International Airport. So, very quickly, who are we? Quick introduction. We're Australasia's largest private sector and technology and IP commercialisation firm. And there's three aspects to our business. We advise on how to commercialise technology, and there our clients range from innovators to investors to Fortune 100 companies. We've got a transactions division, and then we broker the sale and purchase of IP assets, primarily patents. Deal ranges there from hundreds of thousands through to tens of millions. And in technology as well. So we invest in and we commercialise IP-rich technologies. There we're looking for technologies that have a export orientation and have a strong IP position. And if you were going to sum us up in a single sentence, it's that. We help our clients make money from ideas. You've heard a little bit about me, some more detail about some of the other members of the firm. Professor Henry Balanis is Professor of New Product Development and Innovation at Yale University. He invented laparoscopic surgery or keyhole surgery. He holds 110 US patents, thousands of foreign equivalents. He's a world authority on patents, patent commercialization. Steve Stager, Managing Partner at Global IP Law Group, is on our advisory board. He was one of the key attorneys who brokered the sale of Nortel's patents to Apple and Microsoft and RIM, etc. And then some of the other members of the team. Clients, we work with some of the largest companies around the world, and certainly most of the large companies in New Zealand. Covidien is a 25 billion US medical devices manufacturer, largest bank in New Zealand, largest dairy company, largest telecoms, largest airline, largest medical devices manufacturer, first and third largest dairy companies in the world, as well as numerous research institutes and universities. We have a lot of experience in commercializing, that is licensing or selling, etc., or providing advice throughout the world. So that's enough about us. What I'd like to talk to you today is really from our experience of now advising hundreds of organisations on how to commercialise IP and innovation. And I felt that the focus of this talk should be IP not as a source of wealth creation, but as the source of wealth creation. And I'd like to introduce this concept of what we call IP position, and look at the way in which IP directly impacts overall business success by defining two things. IP position defines the size of the commercial opportunity available to a business and the commercial options available to it as well. So a lot of the time when I've attended IP conferences, there's a very significant focus on IP as essentially a legal right. And what I want to look at here is really how that flows into dictating a whole lot of things about the business and how it's going to be successful, wealth creation, etc. So IP position. Now we all know intellectual property is really important. Every single technology improvement to our lives essentially begins as an idea and progresses as an idea into intellectual property and from there out as into a product. But I think one of the things that few people understand is that just how profoundly important the actual IP has on the commercial opportunity that is built on top of it as well. And that's really what I want to address today. So this concept of IP position, and that is the IP position is the combined strength of the various IP classes and organisation controls surrounding a technology. And control includes both ownership of or rights to a particular asset. So it could include a license, for example. Now, the hypothesis I want to put to you today is that IP position directly impacts two very important features. One is the size of the commercial opportunity. That is the amount of wealth that can be created from a given technology. And secondly, the commercialization options. In other words, how this wealth can be created. And these two factors, the size of the amount of money you can make and how you can make that money, in turn affect a host of other issues to do with a particular venture or project or business. That are things like capital requirements, the business model, strategy, distribution, etc. And so this is the hypothesis I'm going to advance to you today, and I'm going to look at each one of these things in turn, the size of the commercial opportunity and then the commercialization options. So, the analogy that we use when we're describing this to clients is that IP position is like the foundation of a building. Weak foundations directly limit the size and scope of the building that is created on top of it. So, if you have a weak IP position, you can only build a small building on top of it. In other words, you have a small commercial potential and reduced commercialization options. On the other hand, if you have a strong IP position, then you can build a much larger building on top of it. In other words, you can have a much larger potential commercial opportunity and increased commercialization options. And I think it's really important when I mention this as well to talk about the fact that IP is more than just patents. Now that should be obvious, I think, to all of us, but a lot of the time I think discussions around IP tend to focus on patents solely, and there's some reference to trademarks, and then confidential information, other rights are sometimes almost forgotten about. So when I'm talking about IP position here, I'm not just simply talking about patents and trademarks, I'm also talking about the entire bundle of intellectual property rights. So it's all of the things that we are familiar with as practicing attorneys and lawyers and IP professionals, but oftentimes we don't give much attention to. In fact, when I'm talking with our clients, I put up this slide and I talk to them about the fact that if you look at most businesses and you look at the volume of IP inside most businesses and the value of that IP, that chart that I just put up before looks very, very different. What you typically find is that most of the value and most of the volume of IP inside most businesses is actually in things like trade secrets, confidential information, copyright, those kind of things. Patents, registered trademarks, etc., sure, they play an important role and they can be extremely valuable. But I think it's important that we realize that IP position is more than simply patents and a patent portfolio. So, how does IP position affect these two things, commercial opportunity and commercial options? Well, I want to start by looking at a very simple graph. I want to compare two products. One's a success and one's a failure. On the other axis, I'm going to define them by having a weak IP position or a strong IP position. Now, it stands to reason if you have a product that's a failure, then regardless of whether or not it has a strong or a weak IP position, then no one copies you. Because nobody copies products that have failed. So we then look at a product that's a success. Now if you have a weak IP position and you have a successful product, then everybody copies you. In fact, what happens inevitably is that someone comes up with a great product, it gets copied, it gets reverse engineered, the IP gets broken, and ultimately you move from an innovation to a commodified product. Margins inside that industry will shift from super profit to subsistence over a relatively rapid period. And in fact, the faster the product life cycle, the faster this occurs. So you can't live in the bottom right-hand quadrant. The only place that you can live in the long term where you can actually gain sustainable margins is where you have a product that is both a success and where you have a strong IP position. That is what enables you to generate sustainable margins over an extended period of time. So if we look at that right side of the graph for a second, this is exactly how IP position affects commercial opportunity, because if you have strong IP, then you can command a greater market share. With a greater market share, you can generate greater revenue. With greater revenue, you can generate greater profit. With greater profit, you can generate an increased return on investment. So the IP itself, the IP position itself, has a fundamental impact on the business. It isn't simply a legal right. It is the underpinning of a whole variety of virtually everything about the business. Now, of course, there are other aspects of the business that need to be carried out, operations, HR, all of those other functions. But the IP is like the bedrock on which the business is ultimately built. And when I reference business, by the way, I'm not talking just about selling an entire business. It could be a project within a business or a division, etc. Now, looking at commercial options for a second. So here we're saying, okay, how does the IP affect your commercial options? If we think about it, any piece of IP can be commercialized via one of three fundamental models. You can deploy it. So you can incorporate that IP into a product or a service, you can manufacture it, you market it, and then you sell that product. You can license it. So there you allow somebody else to do it, and to do number one, in return for which they pay you a royalty. Now none of this should be new to any of us really. Or you can sell that IP, and you sell it to someone who either then on-licenses it, or alternatively, who manufactures using that product. If you think about it, those are really the three fundamental models by which you can commercialize anything at the end of the day. Everything boils down to some kind of variant of those. So, if we put those on two axes, and on the bottom axis we've got inputs, that is fundamentally risk, resource and time. And on the vertical axis we have the outputs in terms of rewards of the dollars created. What we find essentially is that they proceed more or less proportionately upwards. In other words, there is a relatively low degree of inputs required for a sale, but you get a relatively low degree of output. Deployment ranges everywhere from where you outsource all but one step of the process to where you've got total vertical integration. So, what's the relevance to your IP? Well, your IP has a direct impact upon which of those options you're able to pursue. And here I'll give you an example of just how that works. So let's pretend that I have a particular piece of IP that I would like to sell or license. So as a seller, I might go to someone and say, would you like to buy or license my particular IP or technology? The buyer is likely to say, well, I'm not sure. Tell me about this piece of IP or technology and I'll decide whether or not I want to buy or license it. Now, if you have a weak IP position, this is what you're going to say. Well, I can't tell you about it, because if I told you about it, then you're going to know about it and you're going to either take it from me. So I'm not in a position to tell you. The buyer's response then is going to be, well, I'm not going to buy or license something when I don't know what it is or when I can get it for free. So what that essentially means is that with a weak IP position, and again I'm referencing not just patents and talking about all of those different forms of IP, it becomes virtually impossible to sell a license. You are forced into deployment. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does have an impact on the level of inputs required in the business, because to achieve the same level of output, you have to invest a great deal more. In fact, we can take this one step further when we consider that what IP position actually does is the following. It bends that curve upwards. So you get a relatively higher degree of output for the same level of input in the business, regardless of whether or not you sell or license or deploy. It stands to reason. An asset with a strong IP position will sell for a higher price than that with a weak. Likewise licensing, likewise deployment. If you have a weak IP position, it bends that curve downwards. You get relatively fewer levels of output for the same level of input. Right? And in addition to which, it makes sale or license almost impossible, which forces you into deployment. But now you're deploying in the context of a business where you're getting lower levels of output for the same level of input. That might cause you, for example, to reconsider whether or not you actually engaged in that business altogether. So the implication of this is that organizations need to be careful to analyze and assess their IP position, again, not just patents, as this IP is fundamental to wealth creation for both projects and companies overall. Now, I know we spend an awful lot of time analysing patents, and we do keyword searches, and we look at assignees and backwards and forward citations analysis, etc. But this is taking a more holistic view. This is looking at the IP position overall and how it impacts upon the commercial fundamentals of the business that we're engaging in. It's fundamentally, that's why we do IP at the end of the day. It's about business. It's about wealth creation. We need to ask ourselves questions such as, how robust is our IP position? What are its strengths and what are its weaknesses? How can we improve that position and what options are available to us? Does that IP position call into question the viability of the initiative if it's weak? Or if it's a very strong IP position, does that suggest increased investment, for example? In this sense, IP position becomes a very valuable tool for analysing, driving business decisions that ultimately end up creating or destroying enterprise wealth. So how do you build a strong IP position? Well, first of all the IP classes have a role to play. And I would caution everybody to be very cautious of any provider who only gives superficial attention to the non-patent and non-trademark rights, because those things are really important. And oftentimes they are neglected. I often refer to patents and trademarks as the sexy end of IP. They are really interesting. They do tend to grab the headlines. But a lot of the time it's more mundane things that actually create value. Secondly, a strong IP position occurs when you integrate IP strategy, where you're matching the strengths and the weaknesses of the different IP classes together. So in an ideal situation, you get one IP asset that nets off a weakness in another IP asset and vice versa. An optimum IP position is created when each node in the IP position mutually reinforces one another. So you have almost a net that is created around a particular technology or product. And organizations or products lines with an integrated IP position consistently produce sustained above average profit margins if you look at the research. So with a strong IP position, you'll get sustained above average profit margins. Here's a really good example of a product that has done exactly that. If you look at all of the different types of IP that are around a product apparently as simple as Coke, you realize just why this product has been around for 100+ years and has generated such incredible returns for its owners, because they've integrated a variety of different intellectual property rights into one very strong IP position. And that is what has enabled them to create such a dominant position in the market for such a sustained period of time. And in fact, it goes further than this, because a strong IP position actually helps you build an entire business. If you think about it, all products begin as know-how, as an idea inside someone's head. But know-how typically has relatively low IP asset strength and therefore generates typically low enterprise value. There are two fundamental paths from there that know-how can take. One is copyright, if it's content or code-based. The other is patent, if it's an invention-based. Now, these things have relatively more or higher IP asset strengths as well, but they help to drive and increase asset value. But ultimately, the greatest value is created when you have brand recognition. And many studies have shown that businesses with strong brands tend to be those that survive over the extended period of time. So what I'm really trying to say here is that IP position is important not just around specific technologies, but it helps actually grow enterprise value over an extended period of time. So a couple of case studies from work we've done with clients to demonstrate just how important IP position is. So this was an investor who had invested in a tech startup with a strong IP position. It was primarily in patents, and we were advised by the team and the patent attorney this was the case. The progress was poor and the investor wanted an independent assessment. So we conducted due diligence, and what we found very quickly was this. There was a very substantial misalignment in their IP strategy. So they had a market opportunity that was out of alignment with the technology they were practicing and their scope of IP protection. This left them with threat areas where they were practicing a technology and they had no protection. And it left them with areas of missed opportunity where they had IP protection and there was a market opportunity, but they weren't exploiting that technology. Interestingly enough, when you lay in the scope of rival IP coverage, the area of effective protection was in fact very, very narrow, much narrower than they or their attorneys suspected. So we essentially said to them, look, we've identified highly relevant prior art in this field, several viable workarounds to the core IP, there's US patents you're likely to be infringing. Essentially, this business is not going to succeed. And we advised them to shut down the business. Now, the management team rejected our advice. 18 months later, about $3 million later, they shut down the business. The point is, we could probably have given them that advice 2 or 3 years earlier, just by looking at the IP. The IP tells you more than whether or not you're infringing on a particular claim chart, etc. It tells you a whole variety of things, provided you take a holistic analysis and you look at more than just the patents and the trademarks. You look at its impact across the entire business. Okay, another example. Here was a pharmaceutical company we're working with, and what they'd done is they'd trialled a combination of known analgesics, and they obtained very favourable trial data. Now they filed for patent protection. Now they managed to get a patent over this, but it was for a very narrow position. It was for a very specific combination of these analgesics. But they also obtained, and so the patent by itself was pretty much useless. You could easily get around it. But they also obtained regulatory approval for that specific combination. And so despite the narrow patent position and despite the narrow regulatory approval, they actually had a very strong IP position. The reason why is because if someone wanted to gain use of that regulatory approval, they'd violate the patent. If they wanted to get around the patent, they had to move off the combination, and therefore they were outside the scope of the regulatory approval. So this company had actually taken two different assets that were quite narrow and put them together, matched the strengths and weaknesses, and produced a very strong IP position. And consequently, they ended up with a very substantial increase in revenues, and it's gone from literally founded in a garage to a $50 million company in about 3 years. So very successful. So this was another example. It was a New Zealand software company that we were dealing with, and they developed a game-changing technology in the early 2000s. They tried to commercialize it and were unable to do so. They approached us last year with their IP, and we looked at it and we evaluated it and realized there was something very, very valuable here. It was a combination of patents, code, know-how. And so this is a company that had failed to commercialize, had gone nowhere with it. We were able to, by looking at that IP position, realize there was untouched value there. And we worked to sell that IP position. And by about 4 months after we first engaged them, we sold it for an 8-figure sum, so tens of millions of dollars. And we got $45 back for every dollar the shareholders had originally invested in that company. And again, it was by looking at the IP as a holistic position and understanding how we could create value. Finally, this one was an innovator. So a guy in a garage approached us with this idea for a new form of packaging that you could eat with or without a spoon. We assessed the idea and realized that not only was the technology great, again, it had a really strong IP position because you could integrate trade secrets, patents, design rights, trademarks, copyright, all around it. So we developed a commercialization strategy, helped them to execute it. It's been now licensed to some of the largest dairy companies in the world, largest in the world, largest in South Africa, largest in China, largest in New Zealand, whole variety of different areas. It's now shipped 500 million units around the world. It's generating multi-million-dollar royalties per year. Very, very successful. Again, what we looked for here was not just the technology, it was the IP position. The IP position here told us this would have a strong commercial opportunity. We could make a lot of money from it. Secondly, it would give us options to license. And in this case, we didn't have $4 or $5 million to go out and set up a plant to manufacture these things. And even if we had, we would have had problems shifting them and distribution, etc. So, in summary, IP position, it's more than just about the legal right. It directly impacts the commercial opportunity and the commercial options available to you. These two factors in turn define a host of other business drivers such as market, share, profit, return on investment, business model, etc. In this sense, IP is not only the genesis but also the driver of enterprise value creation. And if you're going to build a strong IP position, you need to integrate multiple reinforcing differentiated IP classes to create that value. So hopefully that's been of some interest to you, and I'll be happy to, I think there's going to be questions at the end, so I'll be happy to take questions in. So thank you very much.